Hi, I'm Drew Levanti, and welcome back to Elections Weekly, a show where we take a look at the week ahead through the lens of electional astrology. If you're not sure what electional astrology is or what it is that we're really talking about, hop over to the link in the video description to my website where I have a little bit of a primer on what you can expect from this art. Now, I've been working as an electional astrologer for clients for about oh my gosh, since the summer of 2020, and I've been doing elections for myself every day since early 2018, or maybe mid 2018 was really when I really started to elect for myself every day. So, a lot of what I bring to this is through experience and through having a daily practice. And so that is what this show is about. It's about demonstrating some of this daily practice and trying to give you some ideas for how you can start your own practice with electional astrology, not necessarily for clients. Like what I'm sharing here is not trying to tool you for a client practice, because that's actually much different and I would present the information in a different way. But what it is trying to give you the tools to do is to develop a language for yourself and what makes sense to you based on the elections that I'm presenting here. And the idea is that when you try out these charts, you're going to have feedback. You're going to see what happens, and then you'll be able to look back on the chart and develop your own observations and see what ends up working for you, because this is not something that can just be taken up out of a rule book. We do have instructional texts on electional astrology from millennia ago and over the course of the last 2 millennia, but this is all very personal. You are the astrologer. You are the person looking at the stars. And so it's important that you have your own system, your own way of understanding things. And I'm trying to give you some of the building blocks to build that for yourself. So without further ado, let's dive into the elections for the week. Our first chart is going to be for Wednesday. Since I'm releasing this on Tuesday, our first chart is Wednesday at 6:17 a.m. And so this chart is a Pisces rising. It is actually a sunrise chart. And so because it's a sunrise chart, we know that the planetary day and hour is whatever that planetary day is. And so we see that this chart is on a Wednesday. So being at sunrise, we have Wednesday, Mercury's day, and Mercury's hour. It's the first hour of the day, so Mercury's hour is in full effect. And what's super interesting about this chart, we've been working with Pisces risings a lot over the course of basically this entire show, and Jupiter in Pisces in this chart is super strong. It gives the ascendant, and that is the individual taking this action and moving forward in whatever direction you're trying to go. It gives you a sense of hope and a sense of how things could be better, and a problem-solving mentality. Jupiter is really good for helping us balance things out and solve problems. And so this is a chart that supports that energy, while it also shines a very important light on Mercury in the chart, because it is the day and hour of Mercury. And where we see Mercury in this chart is in the 12th house. It is at 29 degrees of Aquarius, ruling the 7th, as well as the IC. And so this 12th house position of Mercury, I've talked about this before in terms of Mercury as the ruler of the 7th, and therefore the ruler of whoever is the recipient of what you're doing, especially if that recipient is like a one-on-one kind of partner, as opposed to a collective that you're presenting information to. That would be more the 11th. And so with this Mercury representing that other party, the 12th house position of this Mercury does lend itself to another party that's maybe a bit behind the scenes. That other party might not even be corporeal, might not even be in a physical form. It is certainly not in a physical form that you have immediate access to right now, because that 12th house position is a place that the ascendant cannot see and cannot even touch. And so this is somebody who you might be in communication with, who is winding something down, wrapping up a process. This could be somebody who is no longer with us in the flesh, that is. Somebody who's passed on, somebody who is passing on, who's making their cross, or who is passing over, if you will, into the next part of their existence. And we see this with Mercury being in the last degree of Aquarius and it being the day and hour of Mercury. Mercury is a planet that lends itself to assisting us across these boundaries between life and death, between knowing and not knowing, between good and bad. Mercury fundamentally disturbs these clean binaries and these distinctions that exist between one thing and another, and it helps us kind of navigate between those liminal spaces. And so with Mercury being so emphasized in this chart, not because it's on an angle or on the ascendant or culminating or anything, but because it's the day and hour, it gives you an opportunity to connect with that more ethereal, more invisible side of Mercury and what information can come from those invisible places. I like this in particular, this idea of bringing information from other places, because we see that the moon is actually in Mercury's sign and it's moving into an aspect with Jupiter. And because of this, it shows that the moon is bringing something to Jupiter, bringing something to the ruler of the ascendant, to you. And so this is a really excellent chart for receiving information, maybe requesting information if you're dealing with another person who is still alive, and to also potentially get information from somebody who's not around. So if you're interested in channeling or something like that. Of course, you want to be careful, and you maybe ask for help from somebody who knows what they're doing if you want to try something like that, or just play around, low stakes, right? Another interesting thing about this Mercury is that it is about to move into Pisces. So it's about to have this big shift in what we'd call essential dignity. A lot of you are probably familiar with that concept, but a lot of you are probably not. So with Mercury moving into Pisces, it's moving into the sign of its fall in just 1 degree. And so that helps us tell the story of this other person. Maybe it's a family member, or maybe it's just somebody who you're collaborating with at this given time. This person might be about to become closer to you because they're moving into the rising sign, and you have a lot to offer them. And so there's a very collaborative energy that is not yet in effect, but with the selection, you could potentially prime the pump, so to speak, by, it's so funny because it's a water sign with Pisces on the rising, that this can help you move in that direction of greater collaboration by getting some important information that you don't yet have access to. So the next chart that we're going to look at for the week is March 10th, and I will just... So we've got March 10th, Thursday at 10:46 a.m. The point of this chart is to have Mercury culminating. This chart gets weird. I'm so excited for Mercury to move into Pisces because it gives us all these interesting opportunities to play with a fallen planet. Planets in fall are at their lowest place, and this can be seen as a lack of some kind, a lack of respect in particular. But the interesting part about this Mercury is that it does have what's known as reception from Jupiter, because it's in Jupiter's sign while Jupiter's there. So you can think about Jupiter as the host of Pisces, or the lord of Pisces, right? And Mercury is coming into Pisces, and sometimes, when you go over to somebody's house, it's nice if they're around. It's nice if they can tell you where everything is, where you can get what you need, and so on. And this is the case for Mercury right here. Mercury is not necessarily comfortable in this place, but it is made comfortable by somebody else. And this somebody else is this really powerful Jupiter, who has the knowledge, has the information, or the resources, the access to the resources that it needs in Pisces to assist Mercury on its journey through the murky waters of Pisces. With Jupiter ruling the 7th house in this chart, Mercury's assistance is coming directly from the collaborator or the one-on-one partner who is of interest in this chart. We also see that the moon is conjunct the ascendant, and in terms of the exact time of this chart, you'll want to adjust the time in your location either so that the moon is within 5 degrees of the ascendant, or so that Mercury is culminating, or so that it is the planetary hour of Mercury. See if you can get 2 of those things out of 3 at least, and you should be good. Now, with it being Mercury on the MC, the extra layer of this chart is that this is the day of Jupiter and the hour of Mercury. So that dynamism, that assistance that Jupiter is giving to Mercury is being given in the context of the day of Jupiter. Jupiter is the ruler of the day. This is Jupiter's time to rain its praises, to shower down what it can. And this is the hour of Mercury while Mercury is at the highest point. And so even though this is a Mercury that has fallen and so might be operating in a less conventional way, so you taking on this action or whatever kind of project this is, it might be a writing project, it might be something to do with maybe writing that is more creative and less informational. And using this chart where you're really in the right place at the right time. And that's what we see by this angular position, we would say, of Mercury, this position of Mercury being at the top of the chart, elevated, able to have a sense of the lay of the land, knowing what's going on, and being able to strategically navigate that. Even though it doesn't have the resources, it's being given the resources, and it's also being given the perspective to understand a lot of what's going on around it. And it also means that Mercury has access to authority. Mercury is being elevated in this chart, which can indicate that you are in a situation where even if you don't have what you're used to, you are somehow in the right place at the right time to be able to take advantage of a situation that is outside of your control, and you're there. You're right there to move things in your favor. So, with this chart, it's a great Mercury chart, even though Mercury has fallen, and it's always interesting to see charts like this where we can work with essential dignity or planets that are not essentially dignified, but do have something to offer because of other reasons. Another thing that I like about this chart is the moon's next aspect is to Mercury. So that is something to keep in mind as well. We have all of these layering things coming in where we have the hour of Mercury, Mercury culminating, the moon in Gemini applying to Mercury. There's all of these extra layers of signification that help us tell a story that is really about Mercury here and Jupiter, of course. So if we move on to the 11th, we will find a chart that is 0 degrees of Virgo rising. And the point of this chart is that, again, we have Mercury as the ascendant ruler, and we have a very similar dynamic here where even though Mercury is not culminating, it's not elevated, and it doesn't have that kind of right place at the right time kind of energy, it is on a different angle. It's on one of these other really emphatic, emphasized points in the chart, and that is the descendant. So that is the setting position. That is the west. That is where the sun sets, where all of the planets set. And so that position, that 7th house position, has so much to do with connecting with somebody in a contractual way or meeting somebody else where they are at. If you think about what it's like when the sun sets, if you've ever watched that moment where the sun is fading below the horizon ever so slowly, the sun is meeting the earth where the earth is, right? Or we could think of it as the earth is moving up to the sun. But whichever way you look at it, there is a coming together in this place. And so Mercury is delivering information to somebody, right? And it could be, again, of the more creative type of information, or of the, particularly in this early part of Pisces. The early degrees of Pisces are Venusian, and Mercury in Pisces already lends itself to more kind of poetic communication, right? Or things that are more ephemeral and less detailed and more articulating a big picture or a big view of something, or thematic information, things that all kind of relate to each other in a loose way rather than having a tight association, which we would associate with more like a Virgo or a Gemini kind of thing. So this Mercury in Pisces is really good for creative work and submitting creative work to somebody else who is going to receive it, right? Back to this idea of reception, back to this idea of Mercury being in Jupiter's sign and moving toward Jupiter. Jupiter is receiving all this good stuff that Mercury is doing. Now, the aspect, or the conjunction between Mercury and Jupiter is about 14 degrees away, and so this is still pretty wide, but it's a connection that's eventually going to be made. I also notice here that the moon is in between the aspects of Mercury and Jupiter. So the last aspect that the moon made was to Mercury, and the next one is to Jupiter. And so there's this translation, there's this communication happening between Mercury and Jupiter that is being facilitated and quickened, sped up by the moon moving that information between Mercury and Jupiter. So I really love this chart for anything really to do with relationships or building a connection through something that's either creative or an unconventional kind of communication. We see this with Mercury being fallen here. Really love the moon in the 11th here for supporting a sense of community, a sense of togetherness, and especially with the watery quality of this. There's really a lot of movement between or adjusting to and imagining too. Like we have this moon in Cancer trine Jupiter in Pisces, so there's quite a bit of imagination and ability to connect in deeper ways. So I really love this for really anything to do with connecting with another person. I think it's a really good multi-purpose election because, the seventh house is important in a lot of stuff. Just publishing doesn't really feel like the right use for this chart because we have we have Mars ruling the ninth house cusp, and we have Venus ruling the ninth sign, and both of those planets are conjunct the sixth house cusp, which is quite out of the picture and quite it's not emphasized. It's not going to get a lot of visibility with respect to publishing, but it is something that will get reception through submitting something to one person. And so this could be any kind of message with a specific party in mind. And our next chart for the week is going to be Saturday. It is Saturday at 12:01 p.m., so set the chart for 12:01 p.m. in your location, and we're looking to have basically the sun culminating and the moon rising. So if you had to pick between those two, either having the sun on the MC, that is the 10th house cusp, or having the moon on the ascendant, if you had to choose between the two, you would put the moon on the ascendant. In my location, I'm able to get pretty much both, but depending on what latitude you're in, it's going to change a little bit. So the point of this chart is that the moon is in Cancer, and it's doing a lot of really good aspects. It's making some good contacts to other planets. We have this trine to Jupiter, and we have a trine to the sun from the moon. We have this real connection in the water signs that's being emphasized not only through the aspects, but also by the parts of the chart that these planets are in. This is the rising and the culminating point, and we have these aspects connecting those two things. So great chart for visibility, great chart for especially things to do with care. I think a lot of people in our community in particular, we frame our work in terms of care. And this is a chart that is really powerful for moving that forward, or for, adopting an ethic of care and presenting an ethic of care that is important for your public reputation, right? So that sun in Pisces on the MC and that moon in Cancer on the ascendant, this is what this adds up to me. Our next chart for the week is Saturday, March 12th at 12:01 p.m. with approximately 13 degrees of Cancer rising, approximately 22 degrees of Pisces on the MC with the sun. And this chart is actually a really excellent lunar petition. This chart is during the hour of the moon, and the moon is rising in its own sign. And so this fulfills pretty much all of the rules that I could think of for a lunar petition. And what a lunar petition is, or any petition, is when you are basically asking the spirit of a planet to give you some stuff that planet is responsible for giving us. So the moon is responsible for nourishment, dwelling, place, origin, family. All of these things are relevant categories that you could look for support from with a lunar petition at this. So if you were interested in, say, petitioning for a home, of course you want to check what house is the moon in your natal chart, what house does the moon rule in your natal chart, so because this Cancer moon is going to be transiting that part of your chart. So just take note of that. But in general, this is going to be a pretty good lunar petition. So that could also have to do with food, whether that's procuring food or growing food, or somehow gaining access to food in a quick way. We have this cardinal rising sign with the moon ruling it, and the moon is a very fast planet, right? It is the fastest planet, and so there's a velocity to Cancer rising charts that can be really helpful when you need something to happen fast. I will probably use this chart, in fact, because I've got some plans that I'll be sharing shortly. The next chart is going to be 313 at, and when I say 313, I mean March 13th. That is Sunday at 12:37 p.m. So we've got another Cancer rising here, and this is a chart that puts a lot of emphasis on Jupiter. We have Jupiter culminating in its hour. In your location, you might not be able to get Jupiter hour while Jupiter is on the MC, but you might be able to get it while Jupiter hour while Jupiter is trine the ascendant, perhaps. So look into that if it's not. I would most certainly avoid this chart if in your location, which would be like if you're west of Chicago. So that would be like, Mountain Time, Pacific Time, Hawaii. In those locations, the moon is going to be in Leo by that time, and its next aspect is going to be to Mars. And so while the Saturday chart was most certainly a great lunar petition, this one is not, because the moon, even though it rules the ascendant and it's in Cancer, its aspects aren't as good. It's moving in a different direction. Now, there might be some of you out there where the moon is still moving into its aspect with the sun, and so that might still be okay for you. But for people in the Western Hemisphere, that is not going to be a good option for this one. Instead, what I'm recommending for this chart is Jupiter stuff. So all the Jupiter stuff that I talk about: growth, expansion, abundance, thinking on the bright side, being friendly, being optimistic, and sharing your light. This Jupiter-Sun conjunction, I feel, has been a lot about peaceful connection, peaceful relation, peaceful. It's like the peace that you feel in the presence of the soft lapping of the waves. This is the peace of Jupiter in Pisces. And when the sun moves through Pisces, it's always softer. It's always and I think that when you have a chart like this where Jupiter is culminating, you can ask Jupiter for a lot of stuff. Jupiter is combust still at this point, but it's leaving that range. So, what are those last purifications to be made to this particular cycle of Jupiter, with Jupiter being under the beams of the sun and about to make its rise? What have you learned? What have you learned to shed with respect to these Jupiterian themes? Like, are there things around, do you feel at peace? And what would it take to feel at peace? Maybe is a better way to frame that. Yeah. So again, this is just another Jupiter chart, and I love that it's also Sunday. So again, we have this combination of the sun and Jupiter, sun day, Jupiter hour, and both of them are moving toward the MC. So, the sun and Jupiter are both kind of big shots. They're the two biggest planets in our solar system, and the two biggest bodies in our solar system. And Jupiter is very much like the sun in the sense that it's warm. And so bringing some moderation to our solar projections, right? Like bringing peace to the way that our light is shared with the world. And what would it mean to think of our light to the world being something that we share rather something that we show? Like sharing light is for the benefit of people. You can show up in a helpful way rather than in an attention-seeking way. And sometimes these two things can work together. Like, you can help in a way that garners attention. You can help in a way that does make you look good. And there's nothing wrong with that, because at the end of the day, you're still helping. And I think that this chart is a really good one for clarifying the motivation of that help that you're providing in public. So, today I was talking to somebody who they're 21 years old, and they were like, yeah, I used to want to be president and now I want to be an activist. And I'm like, wow, I've been there. When you're young and you want to change the world, and you think about, this is not the case for everybody, of course, but I think fire signs maybe lean in this direction, grandeur and, shooting for the stars, so to speak. And Jupiter is the kind of energy that will take that kind of reach for the stars energy and bring it to a place that is a little bit less Icarusian, a little bit less flying too close to the sun, and bringing us back to a more moderate height, a more moderate elevation that supports a number of helpful ways of being, whether that's in your relationships, whether that's in your career, especially with this being on the MC. There are so many ways that you can be of service just by being yourself. And, I think that we grow through acknowledging what we have to offer and starting from that place of how can I serve? And it makes sense to bring in service here because Jupiter does rule the 6th house. Like, what are you devoted to? What are you committed to? What is your labor dedicated to in this life or in this time, this season of your life? And so these are the things that this chart makes me think of. And I hope that it brings you some insight if you decide to work with this chart in some kind of devotional way. So our last chart for the week is going to be on Monday. This chart was super hard for me to decide on because the moon is really not in a great spot. And so typically when the moon's not in a great spot, I'm looking for other things to be supportive. However, we can't really do Jupiter on the MC, which is maybe like a typical cheat when you have like a really strong benefic, just stick it on an angle and hope for the best. We could do a Jupiter rising chart. We could put Jupiter on the ascendant, just Pisces rising, tried and true, but then we have this 6th house moon, and maybe that's the best we can do. Maybe Pisces rising is the way to go. And if we do go for Pisces rising on this day, the moon is going to be in the 6th house, which, there's a certain logic to having an afflicted moon like this where the moon is, opposite Mars, opposite Saturn. It's being really, really, it's getting a lot of crunchy stuff done to it, this moon. The tricky part about having a Cancer rising, having Jupiter rising for this chart is that you're going to end up with a planetary hour that you don't really want. So either you're going to have the sunrise chart where it's the moon's day and the moon's hour, where that afflicted moon is like ruling the day and the hour, or you're going to have something that is Saturn's hour. You're going to have that pre-dawn chart where it's going to be Saturn's hour, and Saturn's in the 12th and it's opposing the moon. So Monday does not have really any chart that I would ever really recommend for anything. However, there is something to be said for this first 7th house dynamic where the ruler of the 7th is in the 1st. And so this is something where you can really offer something to somebody, right? Like that 7th house person is with you and you're doing great and you can help Mercury. You can help this 7th house person. And so this dynamic of assistance or service comes back again, not just with that 7th house emphasis, but also with the 6th, where again, we have this moon in the 6th. And maybe that would be an argument for making it the sunrise version where it's the moon's day and hour, because then we're really leaning into this 6th house energy. You would just want to watch out for this one, like physical limits, emotional limits, psychic limits. Like how far are you stretching yourself in this act of service, and how generous can you be when you yourself, this Jupiter, are just coming out of the beams of the sun, like out of that hot, dry, barren place. Even though we're in Pisces, we're in a wet sign, we're still kind of dealing with the rays of the sun, which can be a little bit exhausting. And the moon in the 6th can also be a little bit exhausting. So watch out with like energy levels for this one in particular. And while you are, able to help, you might want to be careful about what the limits of your help are and if there's any kind of boundaries that you need to put in place around the assistance that you're giving. So that is going to do it for all the charts for this week. Thank you so much for joining again. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe so that these videos can get in front of more folks and we can keep spreading what I think is a very joyful art of electional astrology. You can also book a session with me for March. I've still got a few sessions available, so check out those links in the video description as well. I do birth chart sessions, which are where we talk about your life, basically. It's all about you. And it's all about your life, which is not all about you. So people in your life or situations in your life, jobs, all that stuff. And I love natal readings. I do this YouTube content about electional astrology because, there's sort of like a clock with it. But I freaking love natal. So I'd love to connect with you for that. I really appreciate everybody joining this week. Come back next Monday and there will be a new video for next week. So thanks so much for joining and I'll see you next time. Bye.